Good afternoon to all those who have just joined. We'll be starting the webinar in a few minutes, so please hold tight. Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar looking at the impact of Microsoft's acquisition of Metaswitch. My name is Dominic Black, and I'll be taking you through this webinar today with the help of my colleagues. Those who don't know who Cavell are, I'm Dominic Black, Director of Research Services. On this call today as well, we're having Finbar Goodbegley, who's our Senior Research Analyst focused on cloud networking, and also Patrick Watson, who's our Collaboration and Contact Center Analyst as well. Just a kind of idea of who Cavell are, we work with service providers, technology providers, and investors, helping them understand the cloud communications market, keeping them up to market trends, understanding the potential for new services, and helping them drive forward into the future with growth. In terms of what we do, we offer a range of analyst services in terms of our research, but also a wide range of consulting projects, doing a lot of due diligence at the moment as acquisitions are hotting up in this space, and events which we're going to touch on a little bit later as well. So to go into the deal and introduce the deal, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Patrick, who's going to take us through some of the core tenets of the deal from what we've heard from public sources so far. So over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Dom. Afternoon, everybody. So as Dom said, let's first of all look at the information that was publicly announced by Microsoft and Metaswitch. So the news broke last week in typical Microsoft fashion in one of their particularly engaging blogs, this time from Youssef Khalidi, who's the Corporate Vice President for Azure Networking. So the blog was published on the 14th of May, which I think was last Thursday. About the deal. I'll come on to some of the announcement details. There were no financial details disclosed at this stage, but we'll have a look at that in a little bit more detail later on. So on the next slide, we're going to look at some of the fundamentals that Microsoft published in this blog that were behind the deal. So the acquisition was building on some of their previous acquisitions, such as the deal for Affirmed Networks in March of this year, with a view to adding networking capability within the Azure platform. In the blog, they also talked a lot about the opportunity represented by 5G technology and how its development will create greater opportunity for virtualized cloud services in a range of different areas. And they also talked about the potential for 5G mobile broadband and how that will enable low latency communication services for enterprises, and why and how that creates an opportunity for operators by enabling innovation, accelerating service deployment, and enhancing security protections. The announcement also referenced the continued deployment of hybrid cloud models and how Microsoft are going to look to cover voice and data solutions across the entire telecoms ecosystem. They also reiterated the importance of working alongside partners and suppliers to explore potential innovations and enhancements relating to RAN, so radio access networks, core networks, and virtualized services. That was what was publicly included in the blog. There was no mention of Microsoft Teams at all. The blog and the announcement were very focused around Azure connectivity and networking. So with that networking focus in mind, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Finbar, who specializes in this area for Cavell, to explain a bit more about the context behind that.
Thank you, Patrick. So I guess we're going to talk a little bit more about Microsoft's strategy here and what their recent acquisition of Affirmed on the 26th of March and things like that means for their sort of networking posture and their networking approach. So if we look sort of at this acquisition, and we look, of course, a quote from the same person who wrote the blog about the Metaswitch acquisition, said that the purpose of acquiring Affirmed was to enable operators to simplify network operations, reduce costs, and rapidly create and launch new revenue-generating services. Now, what this does quite effectively, in addition to the way that Microsoft had been working previously, is sort of launch them into to be a competitor in the telecoms core telecom space. It gives them reach with NFV and other sort of core functions of that telco. It also just sort of allows them to leverage all of their Azure power to provide backbone services and core services to operators and carriers, directly putting them into competition with companies that they haven't been in competition with before, like ALU, Huawei, Nokia, and all those sorts of core network companies. But also trying to compete with companies that feed into that ecosystem, the OSS, BSS companies, orchestration technologies, and more. And really, with the Affirmed deal, the first steps were taken to get Microsoft what it was lacking, which was sort of a core technology, a core telco focus and skill. And of course, we build on this, and we'll talk about this more as we go through this presentation, that the Metaswitch acquisition sort of firmly gives them more characteristics that are going to let them operate in this space as a very strong competitor to a lot of companies who haven't had to face off against Microsoft before. So then we're going to talk just a bit about the sort of currently what they have done together and why that's relevant, just on the next slide, Dom. Yeah, so they already have quite a strong history of working together. Most recently, Metaswitch allowed its Fusion Core, which allowed for private LTE as a service applications to be integrated into Azure. I think Patrick is going to talk a bit later about session was a Metaswitch, but of course that was certified for direct routing over Teams, and also enabling Microsoft Teams to receive calls to and from the PSTN in Teams, which was provided by Metaswitch as well. But the key takeaway from all of this history of working together, if you think about, they were already providing, which was into Azure. Metaswitch was already working very, very closely with Microsoft before this purchase. And the key thing I want you to think about as we go through this presentation is the network side knew what it was buying already. They had worked very closely with Metaswitch to develop several LTE-based services that were helping Metaswitch provide private LTE networks, private 5G networks for manufacturers and things like that. And also enabling sort of as edge in terms of private LTE networks feeding into an Azure edge device, an edge computing device. So when it came to buying this company, Microsoft very much already knew what it was getting in terms of what it had already provided. And with that thought, I'm going to hand over to Dom to talk a bit more about sort of what Metaswitch are and what.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Finbar. I think one of the interesting things that we just heard there is the deal didn't mention anything around Microsoft Teams and how that could all be integrated. We're going to touch on that in a little bit later, really digging down into potentially what are the implications of that. So please, if you're interested in that will be covered later on, kind of our thoughts around that. In terms of who Metaswitch are, they've been around for a number of years and sort of working very hard to maintain a position. But some kind of key stats out the back of the gate here. The revenue is around 180 million in 2019, steady growth, 2.5% year-on-year growth. And even though they're a UK business, 66% of that revenue is from the US. If we look at their customer base, traditionally it's been a lot of small ILECs based in the US, very regional focused. But recently they've announced a few key tier one telcos and new MNOs, mobile network operators, into their portfolio. which is really changing their customer base and how that looks like. From a perspective of the people involved in it at Metaswitch, around 40% of their team are involved in R&D. And although we're talking around this deal and a lot of talk around the technology that's going to be acquired, a lot of this we need to focus on as well is they're gaining some really solid telco experience from Metaswitch, from the staff that they already have there, which is something that Microsoft have been missing for a long time. I think also it's a very software-based company as well. Only 10% of their total revenue comes from hardware, and the rest comes from software-related revenues, which is also key looking at what Microsoft's strategy is in terms of moving everything to OpEx-based models. One interesting thing to point on here, which will come in interestingly later when we look at the SBC side, is they've had an operating loss of $42 million over the last year. Metaswitch has been in elongated legal disputes with Ribbon, both the Genband side and the Sonos side. And then last year, there was a settlement around $60 million on some of their licensing and on their patents, which were in breach. So definitely interesting to see how that's going to play out when we look at the SBC infrastructure that Microsoft have been using, whether Ribbon still maintain a part of that. Looking at Metaswitch's financial reports of what they've been talking around, Metaswitch's key focus has been on the opportunity to serve providers with 5G services and also moving things to the edge and to the cloud. But what they're trying to replicate is success with these traditional fixed providers by providing a full stack of applications for mobile and converged SPs. So really looking at that future strategy around edge, which is a key part of their portfolio. They'd also identified that there's a massive threat coming in from the cloud giants as well, and that includes Microsoft there. They really see that these giants, with their know-how and resources, looking to build applications into the cloud and then leverage these across both on-premise solutions and multi-access compute edges as well. So definitely interesting to see that they already identified Microsoft as competitors to some of these telcos as well, but now we're going to be working with them to help drive that further forward into the future. In terms of portfolio, they've got three key areas of this, mainly around their mobile, fixed network transformation, but then also on their UCaaS side, which a lot of the people on the call and a lot of our customers are most interested in. One of the interesting points to pull out here is that Metaswitch own a lot of their own technology on the mobile and the network transformation side. On the unified communications, they have a strong relationship with Zoom, which provides their Max Meeting product, their collaboration product. And then also they have a relationship with Telax, which was acquired by Intermedia earlier last year to provide their contact center solution as well. So on that unified communication side, they don't own that full stack, which could cause some problems later on in moving into the future. So I'm just going to pass over back to Finbar to really take us through what does this deal bring Microsoft from what they've been saying on, before then we delve a bit deeper into what are the potential ramifications and looking beyond what the press release told us. So over to you, Finbar.
Yeah, so the key point, I think, for what this brings is Microsoft. If we look at those numbers before, we can see that, you know, Metaswitch, while being a successful company, has had some issues with growth, issues with patent issues, and things like that. And it has a lot of tier 2 customers and a lot of customers that don't necessarily generate huge amounts of revenue. But, you know, from our perspective, this is very much a network skills acquisition. Microsoft knew the technologies they were getting from Metaswitch. They knew what they needed after the affirmed acquisition and very much wanted to expand the reach of their Azure platform right to the edge of computing. So they already had Azure Edge cores, which were hosted in data and things like that, and edge zones. But once you start adding in the radio access network capabilities from Metaswitch and other technologies being brought in from the acquisition, and also you get the many years of network skills that Metaswitch's engineering team, and if you look at the figures before, you'll see that a large proportion of Metaswitch's engineering team and employees were actually dedicated towards research and development, which is very much, I think, what Microsoft are really getting from this. It's network skills, it's the ability to build on the existing partnerships they already had through Azure and the existing reach of the Azure edge zones and things like that to create better edge computing plays. And we know that edge computing is likely to be the future of technology as processing power moves out from the core of the network. And if you've positioned yourself with these skills and tools, you then have the capabilities in-house at Microsoft to compete at every level of that edge computing chain. You also, of course, have the core telco element that you already acquired through Affirmed, which allows you to build not only on the edge, but also in the core telco and build sort of an edge-to-edge approach, which could look and be quite strong for Microsoft, of course, given that they already host a lot of services on Azure, and providing those services as well as the outreach through this new acquisition leads to a very strong proposition. For example, Metaswitch are already working to deploy private 5G networks. Microsoft can now tie those private 5G networks into their existing Azure Edge Zone technology and route customer traffic directly to Azure, which of course is a huge gain and a very large gain for customers in terms of latency, in terms of where their traffic's going, especially if they only want services hosted on Azure, but also a big deal in terms of operators who would have previously routed that traffic and charged revenues for routing that traffic. So there's a bit of a question there as to what's going to happen in terms of what services that telcos are going to offer, which sort of leads us to our next question. Given that Microsoft is taking so much of this sort of core network offering, is this good for telecoms operators? Which is on the next slide, if that's all right, Dom. And the summary there is that very much this is a mixed response. Microsoft, we've seen previously, are they really interested in getting into the infrastructure play, into the access play in every region? I think they're perfectly happy to leave that up to operators, carriers, network players. I don't think they're going to ever try and step in and try and replace those. We've seen before where they've tried to offer, specific mobile packages in certain countries. They really haven't enjoyed that experience of working as a regional player. But what they will do is start driving competition in a space that's been dominated historically by traditional telco services companies who haven't had this level of competition from a large blue chip like Microsoft. Despite being large companies themselves, of course, it is a bit different when you bring a company that has less specific skills in networks and things like that, but a lot more innovative power and skills from their other services into the environment. So this may drive innovation in technologies, allowing telcos to have better services on their core network, better NFV, better sort of edge and last mile services, but also lower costs as there's more competition. But it does raise a very big question. If Microsoft is providing all of these core services, and if they're providing Azure business services directly to customers or through service providers, what do the telcos offer? Are they just offering access? Because we know that access costs are falling. Are they just offering networking solutions that aren't covered within this? So I think there's a very big question when Microsoft starts to enter a space this strongly. Everyone who's current telcos included, even if Microsoft are servicing them as well, with their core network offering, there's still a question as to, what are they going to offer when the dust settles, and are they going to have some of their market share taken away from them? Are they going to lose out a bit, despite the fact that they're also gaining benefits? And I think that's quite a big question. So now we're going to discuss sort of potential ramifications. I think, Patrick, you're going to take us through that.
Yeah, thanks, Finbar. So Finbar's obviously looked in a bit more detail about the public announcements and the functions in terms of networking and Azure that Microsoft published. But let's have a look at some of the potential ramifications that weren't necessarily mentioned in those public statements. So on the next slide, what we're going to look at is Microsoft's increasing focus on communications capability within some of its applications. So at Cavell and within the industry in general, we've had massively increased focus on Microsoft's position and future strategy within the cloud communications marketplace. In fact, in two of our most recent surveys, many of the cloud communication service providers that we spoke to saw Microsoft as their sort of biggest existential threat. And the development of its collaboration and communication application, Microsoft Teams, has heightened that interest in the platform and its position and its plans within the market. So Teams now has 75 million daily active users globally. That, I think Microsoft wouldn't deny, that's been massively accelerated by the current COVID crisis. And to be honest, the number 75 million has probably gone up quite a bit since that figure was released. And Teams is particularly relevant for the cloud communications industry because you can enable telephony functionality and connection to the PSTN either through Microsoft themselves or through a process called direct routing. So in both of those models, firstly, Microsoft can provide carrier services and calling plans, which can be provisioned into Teams tenancies in 11 regions globally, including the UK, US, and Canada. And in this type of deployment, Microsoft provides end-to-end services, including numbering and bundled minute plans. Alternatively, and what we at Cavell have seen in the vast number of deployments, Teams users can be connected to the PSTN by third parties through a process called direct routing, where a third-party provider offers connectivity through to a carrier using a session border controller device, which is certified by Microsoft. So although we've seen Microsoft invest in these areas, carrier capability and telephony services, when it comes to Microsoft Teams, we haven't seen a huge focus development of the PBX or telephony functionality within the Teams application itself. In the Microsoft Teams development roadmap, is public knowledge, only a small percentage of the features in development related to those areas specifically. So that implied a couple of things, potentially that PBX and telephony features weren't very high on Microsoft Teams, probably because they were looking to leverage those services from direct routing partners and allowing them to overlay PBX or UCaaS systems on top of those. But now with the attributes of Metaswitch, could they accelerate their own internal development of those PBX and telephony functionalities? And obviously that's purely speculation at this stage. So what we've tried to do on this slide is highlight some of the technology areas and expertise within both the Metaswitch and Microsoft portfolios to see where there's potential areas of overlap or where there's good synergies between the two. So in terms of Microsoft Teams, as we said before, obviously one of the market leaders, if not the standout leader in the collaboration market, with 75+ million users. Teams also has particularly good access to the wider market as a whole, with its inclusion as part of the Office 365 productivity suite, which has hundreds of millions of users worldwide. And as I said before, Microsoft appear to have been focused more on developing the collaboration, meeting, and integration aspects of Teams, rather than the PBX or telephony functionality. And those collaboration aspects have allowed it to compete with rival solutions like Slack or Cisco WebEx Teams. In terms of the PBX and telephony functionality, you would expect that a class-leading UCaaS or PBX solution would outcompete the basic Microsoft phone system that becomes available within Teams with licensing packages. So if there was a potential area of weakness in Teams, then that some people might have construed that was it. So if we take a look at Metaswitch from a cloud comms and collaboration perspective, so one of the market leaders with their provision of a cloud comms soft switch, as Dom and Finbar were saying before, hundreds of service providers and some large telcos leveraging their technology platform. Metaswitch was certified by Microsoft as one of its session border controller vendors. So as Dom was saying, it's interesting to see how that develops going forward and what the ramifications might be for other SBC vendors currently working with Microsoft. In terms of customers, when we were talking about those partners before, as Dom was saying, a large base of mostly small service providers, and those might not prove to be of huge interest to Microsoft. And I've seen a question in the chat about that. So whether those small providers are particularly considered in Microsoft's strategy in this area is yet to be seen. But Metaswitch does have some particularly large carrier customers where there might be a greater opportunity for Microsoft to engage further around some of those cloud networking and connectivity features that they mentioned in the public statements. As Dom said before, in terms of portfolio, the one area that you wouldn't say Metaswitch had one of the leading portfolios was relating to collaboration and meeting technology. As Dom said, they've partnered with Zoom and another Telex for contact center. And so effectively, there's a couple of gaps in that area, but also there's little overlap within Metaswitch's portfolio and Microsoft Teams abilities. So, Dom, if you just move on to the next slide, there is the one area, and there's been a lot of speculation about this, where there is a potential fit. So this wasn't discussed in the public announcements at all. There was no mention of Microsoft Teams, and there was no mention of potential phone system or UCaaS integration into Teams. So as I said before, currently the Microsoft phone system is relatively basic in terms of functionality, and certainly not with other industry-leading PBX or UCaaS solutions. And that's why we've seen a lot of service providers, cloud communication service providers, looking to offer additional phone system overlays on the top of the Teams offering. So in the future, there is potential for Microsoft to leverage some of the technology deployed in the Metaswitch Max platform to accelerate the PBX and phone system functionality that's available in Teams. So as I said, there's nothing in the announcements relating to that, but it would seem strange that you acquire a business with real expertise and knowledge in this area and you don't deploy some of those technologies within your existing product set. So Metaswitch has developed a particularly strong proposition around its mobile provision and its PBX functionality within its core switch. So those might be particular areas where Microsoft look to integrate features and functionality into their existing portfolio. If they did look to leverage the Metaswitch technology and to equip Teams with a fully functioning enterprise suitable phone system, it might remove some of the potential opportunity for third-party providers to provide overlay systems to work on top of Teams. If you're not providing a PBX or a UCaaS overlay, service providers are only left with a few areas in telco services, providing minutes, access, or other supplementary service areas around design and deployment and usage and support. So it's interesting that those areas may be, there might be a slight shortfall in terms of the potential provision there. Metaswitch utilizes, I think John was talking about before, partners for its contact center provision. So this is probably the integration goes ahead as we think it might do. Contact center might be left as the one area where there might be a gap in the Microsoft communication stack. So maybe contact center could be the last area where service providers might look to be overlaying certain services to equip customers with Teams enhanced contact center solutions. If we look at the potential ramifications for some of the partners, so firstly, we've mentioned repeatedly throughout this the Microsoft SBC partner ecosystem. So the main route for adding telephony functionality and PSTN connectivity into Teams outside of using Microsoft as an end-to-end carrier with calling plans is to use third parties through the process of direct routing. So Microsoft currently has no plans to certify partners for direct routing specifically. The integration within Teams is only controlled by the provision of Microsoft certified session border controller devices, which third-party providers or customers must use to enable DR into Teams environments. So the SBC is a key facilitator for Teams telephony functionality. The current certification list includes various vendors, of which they're up on the screen there, who offer Microsoft certified devices, and Metaswitch, as we said, were added to this earlier on this year. Microsoft have announced previously that other companies, I think Finbar mentioned some of these before as potential rivals, as Cisco, Ericsson, and Nokia will also be added in the future to the list of SBC vendors that can enable Teams direct routing. So it'll be interesting to see if the Metaswitch acquisition has any ramifications in this area. Again, there was nothing in the public statement. There's been no public statement about this. So it would be speculative to assume that the current arrangement or ecosystem might change in any way. As before, it's also particularly interesting to see how the partnership dynamics develop. There's obviously been friction previously between Metaswitch and Ribbon, and now that Metaswitch will be incorporated into Microsoft, it's going to be interesting to see how that partnership, if it's impacted, if at all. Obviously, there's a lot of sharing of IP between Microsoft and its SBC partners. So how will that continue in the long run? The one other avenue that it does potentially create with the addition of Metaswitch's SBC expertise is the potential possibility for Microsoft to run SBCs in Azure and allow carriers to connect to those as a service. This is only a possibility. So that was sort of the impact on the Microsoft partner ecosystem. I know, Dom, you've had a look a bit more at the Metaswitch partner ecosystem and how that might be affected.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked for a while around this large base of Metaswitch customers, the small ILEX based around the US, but they also have a large percentage of not small ILEX, but some other larger telco customers as well using their Max UC platform. I think some of the questions raised for those customers from what we've heard is around some of these kind of key areas here. So on the collaboration side, the Max meeting service, as we said, is built on Zoom. I think what's going to be interesting looking at this is how does that change in the future? Are Microsoft, if this does go ahead, how are Microsoft going to allow Zoom to continue to be resold by their customers, considering it's a very competitive offer against the Microsoft Teams proposal? So if Microsoft do move Zoom out of this, and they're no longer allowed to sell Zoom as part of that meeting solution, are Microsoft going to have to start re-looking at how they package together their teams? Are all of the Metaswitch customers going to have to look at taking a full Microsoft license to enable collaboration, which is all those other parts of the E3 or E5 license? Be interesting to see how they actually manage to deliver collaboration, considering that might not fit in with their current licensing model. On the contact center side, Metaswitch had a long-standing relationship with Telex. They were actually a shareholder in Telex. And recently, in November last year, Telex sold to Intermedia, a contact center and UCaaS provider based out of the US. What's interesting in looking at that is we've seen this massive convergence of UCaaS and contact center coming together. And whether that relationship's still going to be able to continue within Microsoft. And looking at how that relationship will continue, I think will be key if there's other areas that Microsoft will invest in. We've seen that Microsoft relationships with Genesys and the likes of Enghouse are potentially stronger than they have with Intermedia. And those relationships, I think, that they already have with Telex may change if they start looking at partners with better integrations into the Teams stack. In terms of the long-going roadmap on the Max UC product, I think a lot of their partners are looking now at kind of how much influence is the roadmap going to have from their traditional providers and the traditional customers looking for new services, and how much is going to be driven by Microsoft and looking at integrations of the Max UC into Microsoft stack. I think that roadmap definitely could be changing, and how much resource is going to be to bettering that UC proposal and UC portfolio in Metaswitch will be a concern potentially for some of those Metaswitch customers. And last but not least is supporting non-strategic customers. As we've said a number of times on this call, this is a deal that was done for technology, and we also think for some of those highly skilled and knowledge base within Metaswitch. Are Microsoft that interested in continuing to support a lot of smaller customers who may not be that strategic to them? It'll be interesting to see, and that might be an opportunity for other vendors to come in here to see if that makes any sense to them to move away from the Metaswitch proposition. So basically, to conclude everything we've been talking about, the deal's really been predicated around Microsoft increasing their Azure capabilities. Azure has a large reach now into both telco cloud and the edge in terms of radio networks and edge computing, and really gearing up to make a complex edge-to-edge offering in the near future. From telco core through to the Azure core, through to Azure services and services built on top of the Azure and back, they've really started to build a complete offering here. In terms of the technology piece, they've obviously acquired some very strong technology, but some great telco skills and experience, which they've definitely been missing from their portfolio. So really interesting to see how they're going to really start to leverage that over the next couple of years. The last point, as we've said, they haven't talked about this, but if Microsoft can integrate Metaswitch correctly, that PBX and UCaaS overlay into Teams may be a thing of the past. And trying to add real value over what Metaswitch have in there could be very difficult. So difficult for operators who are working with Microsoft to see how they're going to add value in the long term there. I think Also, on top of this, there might be some old scores settled. Obviously, Metaswitch has paid out a large sum of money over the last year to Ribbon in terms of their legal settlement. Interesting to see whether Ribbon will remain part of that portfolio going forward in the future. So that's the end of our conclusions. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what we're doing, we've got our reports coming out soon. We're just about to launch our Enterprise Insight reports. And most excitingly, we have 2 new events which we're going to be doing over the next couple of months. CloudCom Summit Invest in partnership with the Q Advisors. Q Advisors are the biggest boutique investment bank focused on the cloud communication industry, looking at understanding and bringing together the CEOs of the people doing all these investments and the financial community as well, to educate them on what the opportunities are to invest in this market, and also what you should be investing in to grow in the future. That's on the 11th of June. And then on the 9th and 10th of September, we're running our Cloud Comms Summit event virtually. We're doing this in conjunction with the Cloud Comms Alliance, but should be really interesting to look deeper into how the market's been changing over the last 6 months, what the market's going to look like in the future, and a great opportunity to network with your peers and colleagues in the industry. So please save those dates in your diary. Now we're going to hand over and answer any questions. We've had a number throughout the session. We hand over, if Patrick, I know, Finbar, sorry, there's been a couple of questions for you. Do you want to take one of those?
Yes. So I think the first question I've just seen that I think I could address is just to ask if you think the Microsoft decision was driven by time to market, or are they interested in addressing the service providers using Metaswitch's solutions? And I think it's a bit of a mix of that. As I said before, Microsoft have already collaborated quite heavily with Metas. So they have kind of a lot of experience there. So time to market is clearly a factor. You're going to know that a lot of your systems are compatible because they were already hosted in Azure. But also, you know, part of it has to be the solutions you're actually buying and who they're going to work with. So I don't think it'll be definitely one way or another. But I think assuming that they have a base level of knowledge of each other because of their previous collaborations means that time to market will be reduced. And also there's going to be an emphasis on using the solutions you've acquired. And the next question I think I'm just going to tackle quickly is you mentioned that Huawei and the stress on 5G, the press release. Is this a deal in any way an answer to the wider attempt for the US to develop an alternative to Huawei because of all the geopolitical issues that's coming from there? And I think that might be part of the factor, though you have to remember that one of the differentiators for Huawei itself is an actual technology differentiation in terms of what they're making from a hardware perspective. And I don't know that I don't know who in the US is offering similar levels of hardware, but I think definitely having a Microsoft 5G like a Microsoft powered 5G platform would be very comforting from a US government perspective. But also, to be fair, beyond the US, it would be quite comforting to a lot of people in Europe as well. So I think that might definitely be a factor in terms of creating this 5G service that doesn't have to go to Huawei, but there does also need to be a technology provider that's going to provide a similar level of technology to Huawei, which is one of the reasons that countries like the UK are still using Huawei, is because they make the best offering.
Great. Just looking through some of these other questions, looking at what will Microsoft do with the hundreds of Metaswitch Tier 2, Tier 3 and rural CSP customers. We're still not sure what that looks like. They haven't announced anything around that. But yeah, interesting to see how that comes out. We've obviously speculated a little bit over the last 25 to half an hour about how that's going to change. But I think there's some serious challenges that they're going to be asking of Metaswitch and Microsoft, of whether Microsoft are actually interested in continuing to support them in the long run. I know the Metaswitch guys will be keen to support them as they've got a very close relationship with them and a long trusted relationship with them. And speaking and working with a number of those Metaswitch customers, they're obviously very happy working with Metaswitch as well. We hear some great things about how they're supporting them as well. Other things coming up. Next acquisition we expect from Microsoft. What technology? I don't know. I think we could tie this maybe a little bit together. Someone else asked around CPaaS, whether this is going to be tied into there. I think Azure's obviously now got a global networking solution and a lot of edge capabilities as well. But then also on the back of that, they've also got some strong telco experience. So whether they could start to build something that competes with the likes of Twilio and Nexmo, definitely something interesting to keep an eye on. Other technologies, I think contact center could be an area, whether they want to start pulling that in. They've obviously got some strong relationships building with the likes of Genesis. But next acquisitions, I don't think there's any more off the top of my head which they could pull together. I don't pass that over to Finbar and to Patrick.
Yeah. So a few thoughts on that. Leading on from the Huawei conversation earlier, they might acquire some sort of network technology vendor who produces edge network devices beyond sort of their edge core and things like that, so they can be that 5G step. But whether they're going to take that on or they're going to hope that an operator takes that on, I think it's quite likely we might see some sort of network security acquisition to sort of bolster all this telco experience they're getting and make sure that they can properly secure all the new core things and things they're building. I think that might be quite interesting. Whether they go further into sort of the networking down the sort of the way that the business networkings are going in terms of more SDN and SD-WAN functions, maybe. I don't think they'll go that far. I think they can rely on companies like VeloCloud and VMware and Cisco to handle that. But they may want some more sort of layered services to add on over all these telco services they're building.
There's a couple of questions there I can take as well. I wouldn't like to speculate on Microsoft's next acquisition. If I knew that, I'd probably be a millionaire. But in terms of, we had a question about the Max offering from Metaswitch only being really a small business PBX, whereas Microsoft Teams gaps really in the large enterprise PBX area. I would slightly dispute that. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of customers and a lot of service providers who either service providers that provide services to smaller customers or smaller customers. If you've got any sort of complexity in your PBX requirement, potentially the Microsoft phone system standalone is not going to be suitable for you. So I think there's probably quite a few areas there where Metaswitch's expertise could be integrated into the Microsoft phone system, and features and functions from Metaswitch IP be quickly accelerated into the Microsoft stack there.
Great. We've had a number of questions, and we apologize for the small technical issues with getting a Zoom invite out. There were some issues with what we were doing. We will be sharing the recording of the presentation to all afterwards, so please keep an eye out in your inbox about how to access that, and slides as well. I think in terms of other questions on there, please direct them to us and send them over to us. I want to planning on finishing at 45 minutes past, so I'd like to thank everyone for joining on this. Thank you all for your time, and thank my panelists as well, Finbar and Patrick, for sharing your insights. Please get in touch if you have any other questions or any deeper looking at how we can help you. Be keen to help and look at how we can do this. So thank you all for your time, and have a great day. Thanks. Bye.